There is a village in Wiltshire that has been empty since 1943. The houses are still standing, the church is still there, the pub is still there, the roads still connect the buildings in the pattern of a functioning community. And around the entire village, a military perimeter prevents you from entering on any day that the British Army decides it needs the village for training. The Army has needed it continuously since 1943. There is a platform in the North Sea, 11 miles off the coast of Suffolk, that declared itself an independent sovereign nation in 1967. It has its own passports, its own currency, and its own constitution. The British government has never formally recognized it, and has never formally absorbed it. Its legal status remains genuinely unresolved. There is a stretch of the Suffolk coast so contaminated by decades of secret weapons testing that sections of it remain inaccessible to the public, and the full inventory of what was tested there has never been made public. In this video, we are counting down 12 places in Britain that you will not believe you cannot visit. Some are restricted by the military, some by contamination, some by private ownership so absolute it amounts to exclusion, some by legal ambiguity so complete that no one is entirely sure what the rules are. Stay with me to the end, because number 1 is a place that is technically accessible, that thousands of people pass within sight of every year, and where the specific history of what happened there makes it a place that the people who know about it tend not to photograph. So hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's begin. 11 miles off the coast of Suffolk in the North Sea, a former Second World War sea fort sits on 2 concrete legs above the water. It is called Fort Roughs. In 1967, a retired British Army major named Paddy Roy Bates occupied the platform with his family and declared it the Principality of Sealand, an independent sovereign nation. He claimed it was outside British territorial waters and therefore outside British jurisdiction. He issued Sealand passports. He minted Sealand coins. He wrote a Sealand constitution. He appointed a Sealand government with himself as Prince Roy. When the British government sent a vessel to investigate and Bates's son fired warning shots at it, the British court that was asked to rule on the incident found that it had no jurisdiction over events that occurred outside British territorial waters. This finding, which did not formally recognize Sealand as a nation but did establish that British law did not apply to it, is the closest thing to a legal ruling on Sealand's status that has ever been produced. Sealand has its own website. It sells titles of nobility. It has been the subject of attempted coups, one of which Bates repelled by force. It has been offered for sale. The Bates family still controls it. Its legal status remains genuinely unresolved. The British government has never recognized it, has never absorbed it, and has never produced a legal ruling that definitively settles what it is. It is 11 miles off the coast of Suffolk. It has been there since 1967. Nobody is entirely sure what it is. In the middle of Salisbury Plain, in the heart of a military training area, the village of Imber has been empty since the 17th of November 1943. On that date, the 152 residents of the village were given 47 days' notice to leave their homes. They were told it was necessary for the war effort, that American troops needed the village for training and urban warfare before the D-Day landings. They were told they would be able to return when the war ended. The war ended in 1945. The army did not give Imber back. The residents petitioned. They marched. They lobbied members of parliament. The army argued that the training requirements that had justified the original requisition had not diminished, and that the village was essential to military training on Salisbury Plain. The residents were never allowed to return. Some of them died before the argument was settled, which it never was. Imber is still inside the military perimeter. The village is accessible on specific open days, usually a handful of days per year, when the army permits public access. The Church of St. Giles is maintained, and services are held on the open days. The other buildings are in varying states of military use and decay. The pub, the manor farm, the school, the houses, are still there in the arrangement of a functioning village, emptied in 1943 and never refilled. The people who were removed are mostly dead. Their descendants attend the open day services. The army still has the village. On the Suffolk coast, across a narrow channel from the town of Orford, a shingle spit extends 10 miles along the coast. Orford Ness. It is now managed by the National Trust as a nature reserve. It is accessible by ferry from Orford in the summer season, numbers strictly limited. And for most of the 20th century, it was one of the most secret military research sites in Britain. From 1913 onwards, Orford Ness was used for the testing of military equipment, weapons systems, and technologies whose specific nature was classified. The development of radar involved work at Orford Ness. The testing of nuclear weapons components, specifically the non-nuclear components of atomic bombs, took place here. The pagoda-shaped buildings that are among the most distinctive features of the site were built to contain the blast from accidental detonations during this testing. They are still there. The full inventory of what was tested at Orford Ness across the 20th century has not been made public. The National Trust manages the accessible areas of the site. Sections of Orford Ness that were used for specific classified programs remain inaccessible. The contamination survey of the full site has not been published in a form that details every tested substance and every area of residual concern. What the National Trust presents as a nature reserve with an interesting military heritage is a site whose full history has not been disclosed, on a shingle spit that changes shape every year as the sea moves the material, and where the specific combination of residual contamination and ongoing coastal erosion creates conditions that the published environmental assessment does not fully address. At the mouth of the Humber estuary on the Yorkshire coast, a narrow strip of sand and shingle extends 3.5 miles into the sea, Spurn Point. It is less than 50 meters wide in places. It moves. The process of longshore drift continuously moves material along the Yorkshire coast and deposits it at Spurn, extending the point southward, while the sea erodes the western side. The peninsula has breached, reformed, breached again. In 2013, a major storm surge breached Spurn and made it an island for the first time in recorded history. Access to Spurn has been restricted since then by the conditions of the road that runs along it, which was damaged in the breach and which the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, the managing body, cannot maintain in a form that allows unrestricted vehicle access. The specific combination of restricted access, constant change, and isolation means that Spurn Point is one of the most unusual publicly accessible but practically inaccessible places in Britain. The lifeboat station, at the end of the point, is staffed by the only permanently resident lifeboat crew in Britain, living in a community at the end of a peninsula that becomes an island in severe storms. The migrant birds that use Spurn as a landfall point during autumn migration make it one of the most significant birdwatching sites in Britain. Getting there in any weather requires navigating a damaged and restricted road across a peninsula that the sea is continuously attempting to reclaim. Dartmoor in Devon is one of the most visited national parks in Britain. Its open moorland, ancient stone circles, and dramatic tours attract millions of visitors. England has a specific legal right to access open land, established by the Countryside and Rights of Way Act 2000. Dartmoor has additional common land rights that predate that act. In January 2023, a High Court ruling found that there was no legal right to wild camping on Dartmoor common land, a decision that removed a right that had been understood to exist for decades, and that placed Dartmoor in the position of being the only national park in England and Wales where overnight camping on open land was not permitted. The landowners who brought the case owned significant portions of Dartmoor common land. The specific legal argument concerned the interpretation of the common land rights established in the Dartmoor Commons Act 1985. The ruling was subsequently reversed by the Court of Appeal, which found that wild camping rights did exist. But the legal process revealed something about Dartmoor that the tourism materials do not foreground. Significant portions of what appears to be open common land, freely accessible to the public, are owned by private individuals whose legal relationship with that land has not been clearly established in a form that is stable against legal challenge. The open moorland of Dartmoor looks free. Its legal status is more complicated than it looks. And hey, before we reach the final 6, if this video is showing you a Britain where the places you think are accessible are often not, and the places you think are free are often contested, hit the like button and share it with someone who thinks the British countryside is freely open to the public. Because the next entry is on land belonging to the king. Now, let's continue. The Sandringham Estate in Norfolk is the private property of the monarch. It covers approximately 20,000 acres. It has a visitor attraction, a country house open to the public in season, and gardens that can be visited for a fee. The surrounding estate, the farms, the woodland, the game covers, is private land with no public right of access beyond the specific public rights-of-way that cross it. The specific rights-of-way that cross the Sandringham Estate have been the subject of ongoing dispute about their exact routes, their maintenance, and their accessibility. The Royal Estate's management of the footpaths that cross its land has been criticized by ramblers' organizations for the condition and accessibility of those paths. A private estate of 20,000 acres, in a county where public access to the countryside is significantly limited by private land ownership, creates a specific pattern: vast landscape visible from the road, minimal legal access to walk through it, and the specific authority of a royal estate that creates a social and practical pressure to defer to the ownership that is difficult to quantify, but easy to experience. The Alnwick Estate in Northumberland is the private landholding of the Percy family, the Dukes of Northumberland. This channel covered Alnwick Castle in the video on British castles that most people do not know about. What that video touched on briefly, and what this entry addresses directly, is the land. The Percy family owns approximately 100,000 acres in Northumberland. It is one of the largest private landholdings in England. The public walks the castle as a tourist attraction and visits Alnwick Garden as a paying visitor. The 100,000 acres that surrounds the castle and extends across the Northumberland countryside is private land with limited public access. The specific history of how the Percy family came to own 100,000 acres of Northumberland is a history of feudal land grant, inheritance, and the specific English legal structures that allowed aristocratic landholdings to be maintained across centuries, without the kind of redistribution that comparable landholdings underwent in most of continental Europe. Scotland has land reform legislation that has progressively addressed the concentration of private land ownership. England does not. The Percy family 100,000 acres in Northumberland is not unusual for the English aristocracy. It is an example of a pattern. The pattern is that a small number of private families own vast portions of the English countryside that the public cannot access, and the legal framework that produced and maintains this pattern has not been subject to the kind of comprehensive reform that its scale would appear to warrant. Lundy Island in the Bristol Channel was covered in the British Islands video on this channel. What belongs specifically in this video is not the island but the water around it. In 2010, the waters around Lundy Island became England's first statutory marine conservation zone, protecting the marine environment that surrounds the island. The designation prohibits certain activities, including some forms of fishing, in the protected area. The enforcement of the marine conservation zone around Lundy is conducted by the Inshore Fisheries and Conservation Authority and the Marine Management Organization. The specific fishing communities of the Devon and Cornwall coasts, whose traditional fishing grounds overlapped with the Lundy Marine Conservation Zone, were not consulted in a manner that their representatives considered adequate before the zone was established. The ongoing conflict between the conservation objectives of the Marine Conservation Zone and the livelihood interests of the fishing communities that have worked the Bristol Channel for generations is documented in the formal records of the management body and in the representations of the fishing industry. The waters around Lundy look the same from a boat. The prohibition is invisible in the sea. The enforcement is intermittent. And the fishing communities who have worked these waters for generations are navigating a regulatory change that was made above the level at which its consequences are experienced. In the South Atlantic Ocean, approximately 1,000 miles from the coast of West Africa and 800 miles from the island of St. Helena, Ascension Island is a British overseas territory. It has no indigenous population. It has been continuously inhabited since the Royal Navy established a garrison there in 1815. Today, approximately 800 people live on Ascension, most of them employed by the military, communications, or government operations that justify the island's strategic value. Ascension Island is the location of RAF Ascension Island, a British airbase. It is the location of relay stations for the BBC World Service. It is the location of infrastructure associated with the United States Space Force. The people who live on Ascension have no right of abode. They are there because they are employed to be there. When their employment ends, they must leave. There is no path to permanent residence, no path to citizenship based on birth or prolonged residence on the island. A person born on Ascension Island to parents working there has no right to remain on the territory where they were born. The legal framework that governs Ascension Island produces the specific condition of an inhabited territory without a permanent population, a community without the right to become one, and a place where the human attachment to location that produces permanent communities is structurally prevented by the terms under which presence is permitted. This channel covered the Myned Epynt Plateau in the Wales Abandoned Places video, in the context of the Welsh-speaking farming community evacuated in 1940 to make way for the Sennybridge training area. It belongs on this list too, for a specific reason. Epynt is not simply a place you cannot visit. It is a place where the specific form of what was removed has never been fully acknowledged. The 54 farms evacuated from Epynt in 1940 were not simply agricultural operations. They were Welsh-speaking communities, chapels, schools, networks of kin and culture that had sustained Welsh language and Welsh rural life in this part of Powys for generations. The military training area that replaced them has been used continuously since 1940. Live firing takes place on ranges that cover much of the former farming community's land. The farmhouses that survived military use are roofless ruins. The military road network that replaced the farm tracks crosses land where Welsh was the language of daily life. You cannot walk most of Epynt without military permission. The red flags fly on most days. The land that was a Welsh-speaking community is a firing range. And the families who were told they could return after the war are either dead or still waiting. Their descendants attend annual services at the chapel that has been maintained on the training area. The Welsh language lost another of its rural heartlands in 1940 and has been losing it continuously since, on every day that the red flags fly. On the Somme battlefield in northern France, the Thiepval Memorial to the Missing of the Somme lists the names of 72,195 British and South African soldiers who died on the Somme between July 1916 and February 1918 and have no known grave. The memorial was designed by Edwin Lutyens and unveiled in 1932. It is managed by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. It is in France, but the specific experience of Thiepval, the scale of the names, the 72,195 people recorded as missing rather than buried, the specific implication of missing, which is that their bodies were so completely destroyed by the conditions of the Somme that they were never recovered, makes it the most psychologically inaccessible place on this list. You can visit Thiepval. There are no physical restrictions on access. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission maintains it as a public memorial. What makes it inaccessible in the specific sense this video is examining is what it asks of you when you arrive. The 72,195 names are arranged on the memorial's 16 piers. Reading every name at a comfortable pace would take several days. Most visitors spend an hour. The memorial exists at a scale that exceeds what a visitor can process in any realistic visit. It is inaccessible not physically but psychologically, and the specific form of inaccessibility it represents, 72,000 names, is the direct consequence of decisions made in London and Paris about how to fight a war on the Somme. And now we have reached number 1. Aberfan in Merthyr Tydfil is a village in the South Wales valleys. This channel covered the 1966 Aberfan disaster, in which a colliery tip collapsed onto Pantglas Junior School, killing 116 children and 28 adults, in the UK disasters video. It covered the financial injustice to the community, the National Coal Board's negligence, and the government's use of the disaster fund to pay for the tip removal. What belongs at number 1 on this list is something different from the disaster itself. Aberfan is accessible. There are no physical restrictions on visiting. The memorial garden that replaced the school is open. The cemetery on the hillside above the village, where 116 children are buried in rows of white headstones, is open. The community is alive around these sites. People live in Aberfan, go to work in Aberfan, raise children in Aberfan, within a few hundred meters of both the memorial garden and the cemetery. And most people who visit Aberfan do not photograph it. Not because it is legally prohibited, Because there is a specific form of human recognition that occurs when you stand at the Aberfan cemetery and read the headstones, that removes the impulse to photograph and replaces it with something else. The headstones are small. The children were between 7 and 10 years old. The dates of death are the same on row after row. The 17th of October 1966, a Tuesday morning. School had just started. The tip that killed them was visible from the school. The National Coal Board had been warned about it. The warning was not acted on. The children are buried on the hillside above the village where they lived. Aberfan is the most accessible place on this list, and the one that the people who have been there are least likely to tell you to photograph.